The Spiritual Warrior. Acariya became seriously ill on many occasions while living deep in the wilderness areas of Chiang Mai. Sometimes he came very close to death. Had he been like most people, totally dependent on doctors and their medicines, he would probably have succumbed long before. But Acariya was able to survive by using the curative powers of Dhamma to treat himself. He said that as soon as the symptoms of illness began to appear, the therapeutic qualities of Dhamma immediately arose in response and began to effect a cure. Such was his temperament that normally he showed little interest in conventional medicines. Even in old age, when his vitality was steadily declining, he continued to prefer the therapeutic qualities of Dhamma to maintain well-being in his body elements. Acariya once stayed with several other monks in a mountainous area full of malaria. One of the monks happened to contract the disease, but not a single medicine was available to treat it. When the fever was at its worst, it raged continuously all day. Acariya visited the monk every morning and evening to instruct him in the use of investigative techniques for reducing fever. Meditation methods he himself always used with good results. But since their levels of spiritual attainment were so different, this monk was incapable of investigating in the same way as Acariya could. Each time his fever intensified, he had to simply wait for it to abate on its own. He had developed no effective methods for bringing it down himself. Eventually becoming rather exasperated, Acariya scolded him. "It seems you're a Maha in name only, since the knowledge you have learned is obviously of no help when you really need it. What's the point of studying to be a Maha if you're just going to waste a lot of paper and then come away empty-handed? The knowledge gained from studying should benefit you in some way, so I cannot figure out what you've been learning that's so completely useless. Here you are virtually dying of fever, but your learning can't help alleviate your condition even a little bit. What's the purpose of all that learning anyway? It doesn't make sense to me. I can't figure it out. I haven't learned any grade of Bali studies, not one. I have learned only the 5 Gammatana that my preceptor gave me at my ordination, which I still have with me today. They are all I need to take care of myself. They don't make me weak like you. You're as weak as you are educated. In fact, you are weaker than a woman with no education at all. You're a man and a Maha, so why all this weakness? When you get sick, you exhibit no manly characteristics, nor any indication of the Dhamma you learned. You should take all your masculine equipment and exchange it for a woman's, thus completing your metamorphosis. Maybe then the fever will abate a bit. Seeing that you're a woman, the fever may be reluctant to torture you so much. Instead of seeing some reassuring signs of defiance and courage when I visit you, all I see is a weak display of self-pity. Why don't you investigate those Gammatana in the Bali studies you've learned? What does Dukkhang Ariyasachang mean to you? Does it mean weakness? When having a fever, just cry and long for your parents. Is that what it means? If you cannot bear even the painful feelings arising from a fever, in a truly life-threatening crisis, you'll be overwhelmed and unable to cope. Even now you can't manage, so how can you ever hope to understand the true nature of the noble truth of dukkha? Anyone wanting to transcend the mundane world must realize unequivocally the truth inherent in each of the noble truths. But as soon as the truth of dukkha awakens and begins to become a little active, you lie down and admit defeat. What do you expect to gain from that? Having given this fiery piece of advice to probe the monk's character, Acariya paused quietly for a moment. He then noticed that the monk was sobbing, tears streaming down his face. So Acariya quickly found an excuse to leave and return to his hut, telling the monk not to worry. He would soon get better. He assured him that he had only pretended to give him a hard time. Reconsidering the matter that night, Acariya decided to try a different type of medicine, since the remedy he had just prescribed was probably too harsh for the patient. He just was not strong enough to take it. From the next morning onward, he changed his approach completely, never again displaying any fierceness with that monk. From then on, he assumed a sympathetic, comforting attitude, pampering the monk in a way that was very uncharacteristic of him. His speech was sweet and gentle, like large quantities of molasses being poured out every morning and evening, until the whole area seemed sweet and fragrant. suiting that monk's outbreak of weakness perfectly. He watched over his patient's progress, giving him these sugar-coated pills every morning and evening, until it was clear that both the patient and his fellow monks were contented. The patient continued to improve with each passing day, until finally he made a complete recovery, a process that lasted many months. Obviously, this particular medicine was effective beyond all expectations. Such are the therapies of a clever doctor, who always has the intelligence to adjust his treatments according to the circumstances and then administer them appropriately. Consequently, he is an excellent example for the rest of us who are searching for wisdom, which is why I have included the preceding incident. Those who are interested should be able to gain some benefit from reading it, for it concerns the skillful means of a clever man whose wisdom was so sharp that he was never stymied by any turn of events. Rather than remaining passive in a critical situation, Acariya instinctively preferred to analyze the crisis with mindfulness and wisdom. When he was sick, or when his investigations uncovered some particularly insidious kilesas that he found to be especially obstructive, these constituted critical situations. Instead of feeling resigned, his chitta responded by circling the problem day and night until he found an ingenious method to deal with the crisis, allowing him to overcome it gradually and move on unhindered. From the beginning stages of his practice to the very end, he invariably experienced good results from this approach. When the monks living with him became ill, he usually advised them to develop meditative techniques for relieving the symptoms, so they would not become overly dependent on medications. At the same time, he wanted them to develop those techniques into methods for investigating Dhamma. Acariya believed that physical and mental pain are direct manifestations of the truth of dukkha, and as such they should be investigated until that truth is understood. He did not expect his monks to simply succumb to pain as though they had never before received training in Dhamma. Acariya acquired many techniques from the illnesses he suffered. He never let the pain of his illness subdue him without probing into the nature of that pain as best he could. At such times, he believed it imperative to investigate pain to the very limit of one's ability in order to determine whether or not mindfulness and wisdom can cope with the task at hand. When found to be deficient, they could be modified and improved until their performance is deemed satisfactory. When the highly trained forces of mindfulness and wisdom enter into combat with feelings of severe pain, the heart will not be apprehensive, as it confronts the truth of dukkha, which is a genuine truth. Mindfulness and wisdom are then fully up to the task. They remain unshakable while being buffeted on all sides by an onslaught of pain coming from every conceivable direction. In the midst of this intense pain, they are able to narrow down the scope of their investigation until it focuses sharply on the very principles of truth. Such mental training employs the factors of mindfulness, wisdom, faith, and effort, instilling them with greater strength and courage. For precisely this reason, Acariya liked to emphasize the investigation of painful feelings to his disciples. When the moment of truth arrives and the body is about to break up, one should experience no fear of the agonizing pain that emerges at that moment. Investigating as prescribed, the meditator clearly perceives the true nature of both body and feelings, meaning that he lives in comfort and dies triumphant. Such is the path of the warrior who emerges truly victorious to become a superior individual. He conquers himself, becomes superior within himself, and is fully contented. Acariya was an exemplary teacher in every aspect of his practice. His persistence, fortitude, courage, frugality, and all-round ingenuity were outstanding qualities that put him in a class of his own in the present day and age. It would be very difficult for any of his disciples to surpass him. He possessed celestial hearing and celestial sight, as well as parachittavidya, the ability to communicate psychically with beings as diverse as animals, humans, ghosts, devas, brahmas, yamas, and nagas. He could see not only animals and humans with their gross physical bodies, but also the subtle non-physical forms of ghosts and devas. He knew the intimate joys and sorrows of human beings, and could read their innermost thoughts. Monks who lacked mindfulness to supervise their thoughts, letting their minds wander constantly, often became aware of those thoughts only when they heard Acariya give voice to them. Some of the more pathetic ones were so bemused that they did not realize Acariya was referring to them. It wasn't necessary to be in his presence. Just living together with him in the same monastic community was sufficient reason for caution. Any monk mindlessly giving rein to wild thoughts was sure to hear something unusual from Acharya Mun when eventually they met, but especially at risk were those who dared to let their minds wander in his presence. It didn't matter what he was doing at the time. He might be instructing the monks, or having a conversation, or whatever. He would give the culprit a tongue-lashing, or use some unusual ploy to get his attention. Only when he felt disinclined to respond did he allow such thoughts to pass unchallenged. According to the accounts of many senior disciples who lived with him in Chiang Mai, Acharya Mun's mastery of such faculties as celestial hearing, celestial seeing, and thought-reading was so amazing it could be frightening. His ability to read thoughts was so lightning-quick that those entertaining unwholesome thoughts almost invariably heard about it. Consequently, monks who lived with him needed to guard their sense faculties very carefully. If not, they certainly got caught, for they could not elude his penetrating genius and find a safe way to hide. Once, due to his fear of Acharya Mun, a monk thought about the ferocity of Acharya Mun's admonitions. When the monk next saw him, Acharya Mun immediately addressed the question. Almost everything we use, from our food to our requisites to the robes we wear, must pass through various stages of preparation before being turned into useful items. Rice must be planted, harvested, and cooked. Wood must be cut, sawed, and planed, and cloth must be woven and sewn into robes. Isn't that right? These things don't become finished products ready for use or consumption unless a lot of work is done on them. Food and shelter are the product of man's labor. They do not simply materialize from nowhere. Only corpses are totally inactive, lying lifeless and having no need to provide for their own livelihood. With no reason to adjust their behavior, they have no need for a teacher to scold them and give instructions. But you are alive and still seeking a teacher's guidance. Yet you're unreasonably afraid of your teacher, citing his fierce admonitions as a rationale. Then again, if your teacher simply kept his mouth shut, you would probably accuse him of failing to teach you, and thus be even more upset. In the final analysis, nothing quite suits you. Your thoughts jump around like a monkey, jumping up and down in the trees. If it keeps jumping about long enough, it will jump on a rotten branch and end up in a heap on the ground. Which do you want to be? Do you want to be a monkey jumping on a rotten branch, or a monk with a teacher to guide you? Sometimes he confronted the culprit directly, motivating him to become more mindfully aware of his own thoughts. At other times he simply made some oblique, sarcastic reference to a monk's thoughts. The objective in either case was to warn a student that his thoughts had not passed into oblivion, but could return again to haunt him. He was made aware of his mistake so that in the future he could exercise more restraint in his thinking. Sometimes, in order to inspire his disciples in their practice, Acharya Mun gave a fiery discourse in which he offered himself as living proof of what could be achieved through perseverance and courage in the face of death. If you allow the fear of death to stop you from practicing meditation with uncompromising diligence, you will be obliged to come back and die time and time again in future births. Those who can overcome their fear of death will be able to reduce the number of future births until eventually they transcend birth and death altogether. Never again will they return to bear the burden of dukkha. While persevering unflinchingly in the face of excruciating pain, I myself passed out 3 times, yet I did not die. I managed to survive and become your teacher. None of you have ever persisted in your efforts to the point where you passed out unconscious. So what makes you so afraid of dying? If you don't actually experience what it's like to die, it is unlikely you'll ever see the wonders of Dhamma. Whether you believe it or not, this is the method I use to realize Dhamma. So there is no way I can teach you to merely take it easy. Eat a lot, sleep a lot, and be lazy. Then the kilesas will take fright. I cannot teach that because that's not the way to instill fear in the kilesas. Such an attitude will only amuse the kilesas. We thought these monks had come to be diligent, so why are they lying around like breathing corpses? These breathing dead are hardly worthy of admiration. After Acharya Mun finished speaking, a certain monk in the audience thought to himself that persevering to the point of passing out was excessive. If I have to reach the point where I pass out unconscious, I don't want to go to Nibbana yet. I'll just put up with the pain and suffering of this world like everyone else. I've got lots of company. If going to Nibbana means pushing oneself to the extent of passing out, then whoever wants to go is welcome to do so, but I'm not going, that's for sure. Life in the world is surely painful, but not nearly as painful as being rendered unconscious. Besides, if we have to pass out before we can attain Nibbana, that means there's not much difference between Nibbana and a drug-induced coma. Who wants that? I certainly don't. I have no desire to pass out. Just seeing someone else faint scares me to death, let alone having it happen to me. Before long, Acariya Man began speaking again, this time in heated tones that penetrated forcibly into the monk's reverie. You don't believe me, huh? Do you think I'm lying to you just for fun, or what? If you do not trust me, please leave. Why stay here being a burden on this monastery? I did not invite you to come here. You came on your own, so you should leave on your own. Don't wait to be thrown out. It's useless for you to stay here anyway. The Buddha's teaching wasn't proclaimed for idiots like you. Your way of thinking is entirely inappropriate for a monk wearing the yellow robes. A Buddhist monk is one who puts his faith in Dhamma. But since your ideas contradict the Lord Buddha's path to liberation, it is obvious that you don't trust me or the Dhamma. You are welcome to go anywhere to eat and sleep in comfort, without having to trouble yourself with meditation practice. If you come to realize the truth of Dhamma using this method, please come back and have mercy on this stupid old monk. I shall raise my clasped hands to the heavens to honor your gracious majesty's benediction. I teach the truth when I say that anyone expecting to transcend dukkha must be fearless when facing death. But you don't believe it's true. You figure it is better to die and be reborn in this world so you can continue carrying your burden of misery wherever you go. If you want to go on like this, that's your business, but don't come here and contradict the teaching of the Lord Buddha. If you do, you will be a thorn in the Buddha's side and an obstacle blocking the path of those truly wishing to follow him. Opinions like yours are not only wrong, but should you decide to give voice to them, you will become an enemy of Buddhism and religious people everywhere. I assumed that you came here to develop yourself spiritually and so uphold the sasana. I never imagined you were going to ruin yourself and then destroy the sasana and devoted followers of the Lord Buddha as well. But now I realize that you have come like an executioner to destroy everything. You'd better change your attitude right away. Otherwise, you will certainly ruin yourself and take a lot of other people with you. And that would be a terrible shame. The Lord Buddha is said to have passed unconscious 3 times as he strived to attain enlightenment. Don't you believe it is true? If you don't, perhaps you suppose the Buddha was lying to us. A person like you, who ordains as a Dhutanga monk but still refuses to trust the Buddha and his Dhamma, is someone devoid of intrinsic human value. Your opinions make you no different than a breathing corpse, a living, stinking corpse that somehow manages to keep breathing from one day to the next. What do you say? Which path are you going to choose for your own safe passage? I have no better path to offer you than the one I have already specified. It is the path that the Lord Buddha and all the Arahants have taken. There is no easier, more esoteric path. I have followed this path from the time of my ordination up to the present, and it is the source of the Dhamma that I teach to all my disciples. This was one of the most impassioned declamations ever given by Acariya Man, right to the point and full of fireworks. What I have recreated here is merely a sample, not the full substance of what he said by any means. Those listening were so shaken and intimidated they nearly sank through the floor. Never in their lives had they heard anything like it. By going straight to the point, these fiery expositions caused his audience to see the truth of his words, and thus submit to it, even as they felt frightened to death of him. Realizing the truth of what he heard, the monk, whose thoughts provoked this barrage, gradually acquiesced until he accepted it totally and without reservations. As that happened, the intensity in Acariya Man's voice gradually subsided until he sounded quite conciliatory. When he was convinced that the monk had accepted the truth, he finished speaking and adjourned the meeting. As it disbanded, there was a stir of excitement. The monks asked one another who had dared entertain thoughts so perverse to have elicited such a fierce response from Acariya Man that his voice raged furiously, like thunder and lightning. There must have been some provocation. Otherwise he would never have given a blazing admonition like that. Those thoughts must have affected him so acutely that he couldn't resist unleashing the full force of his reason. Eventually, the monk in question owned up to the thoughts that I have mentioned before. Normally, Tutanga monks did not conceal their thoughts and opinions from one another. If their thoughts became the subject of Acariya Man's rebuke, they invariably admitted their lapses in judgment when they were questioned later. Although the monks usually found it amusing when a fellow monk was roasted by Acariya Man, they also became conscious of their own shortcomings. Such shortcomings could be easily exposed on alms round, or on some other errand outside the monastery, where a monk encountered an emotionally stimulating object that stuck in his mind and became a preoccupation. Such indiscretion was likely to elicit the kind of fierce response that frightened everyone within earshot and prompted nervous glances all around. Terrified of Acariya Man, ashamed in front of his friends, the culprit was usually shaking as he sat, rooted to his seat, with his head bowed and not daring to look up. When the meeting was over, the monks would ask around and find out that, as always, there was indeed one in their group whose thoughts caused Acariya Man's rebuke. It was rather a pity, for those monks had no intention of offending Acariya Man. Like people everywhere with kilesas, they were emotionally susceptible to things in their environment. Their mindfulness was simply too slow in catching up with the lightning quickness of their minds. Thus, Acariya Man's frequent scoldings. Acariya Man was extremely quick at reading other people's thoughts. Monks who lived with him had no doubts whatsoever about this. He was able to read our errant thoughts and then caution us about them with unerring accuracy. Only on occasions, when he could not be bothered to say anything, did he remain quiet. Though his rebukes were frequent, he did relax occasionally to let us catch our breath. Otherwise, we'd probably have suffocated to death. Because of my incurable restlessness, I myself was chastised more often than most. But those of us who endured and lived patiently with him over a long period of time were usually energized in our meditation practice. We developed a firm anchor in our hearts as a result of his exhortations, which constantly forged, tempered, and beat our practice into shape. Constant vigilance, and the restraint it fostered, made it possible to cultivate the mindfulness and wisdom necessary to resist incidental temptations. In the context of the art of magic, it can be compared to learning the necessary skills and then testing them out against the teacher until one is impervious to attack. Calm and secure in the knowledge that their harmful potential has been neutralized, one can withstand guns and swords unperturbed. In the context of Dhamma practice, it means one can stand firm in the face of evocative emotions and temptations that normally arouse desire, without fear of being influenced or seduced. In other words, remaining unperturbed in all situations. The trouble is, most people react to talk about Nibbana by feeling oddly dejected and dismayed. It doesn't put them in a good mood as does talk about worldly matters. Having no personal experience of Nibbana, they probably think that it's not as enjoyable as the humdrum things they are accustomed to. Not only has the present generation lost interest in Nibbana, even our parents and grandparents were not much interested, nor did they encourage others to take an interest. At most, they may have encouraged their family to go to the local monastery from time to take the precepts and hear Dhamma. Perhaps they sometimes encouraged their families to do meditation practice to calm them down a bit and keep their behavior within acceptable limits. Of course, one way or another, they did manage to advise their family and friends to do just about everything else, until fed up with hearing their advice, most people no longer bothered to take it. Undoubtedly, most people have already decided that Nibbana must be a very silent place, there being no music or entertainment, and no one to indulge them in their favorite pastimes. They probably see it as a place devoid of anything stimulating or exciting, and therefore they don't want to go there. They fear dropping into a still, silent hell, without a soul in sight. There would be no family, no friends, and no sounds, ever, of birds and cars, or laughter and crying. It appears to be a rather bleak, undesirable place to go in every way, so people who still harbor ambitions do not want to go to Nibbana, and even if they did, they would be unable to go, for their ambitions would hold them back and make them hesitate. People who can truly attain Nibbana are those who have absolutely no worldly ambitions or involvements, being neither passionate nor impassive, neither relaxed nor tense, but remaining perfectly balanced. They are naturally centered in the middle way, having no desires, no expectations, and no longings. They take no enjoyment from worldly pleasures, which merely agitate the heart and cause frustration. Always imperturbable, they experience only an exquisite, serene happiness that contrasts sharply with the happiness of those whose hearts are corrupted by worldly concerns. Such mundane happiness, being ambiguous and fluctuating, is always fleeting and unreliable. It resembles murky, muddy water. It's like food that's spicy, sour, bland, and salty all at once. Besides causing indigestion and uncomfortable drowsiness, it is not very appetizing. So people should carefully examine the things they encounter every day, and test them to discover which ones are advantageous and which are not. Then they can filter out the unwholesome elements and prevent them from piling up in their hearts until their numbers overwhelm and there is no room to store them all. Otherwise, wherever they look, they will see only this accumulation of misery that they've collected. When it comes to self-discipline, the wise are much more clever than we are. Everything they do, say, or think is directed precisely toward achieving their intended objective. They are not at odds with the truth, nor arrogant and conceited about their achievements. When cautioned, they quickly take the warning to heart as a useful lesson, which is quite different from the way the rest of us react. By following the example of the wise, we will become reasonable, moderate people who refuse to follow those desires that have ruled over our hearts for so long. Our efforts to overcome those desires will thus transform our hearts in a way that definitely results in a degree of contentment that's clearly evident to us. Even without millions in the bank, our own exemplary conduct, plus what little wealth we do possess, will be sufficient to keep us happy. Clever people manage their lives in a way that is conducive to peace and security. They don't feel the need to rush around trying to make vast sums of money in order to maintain a sense of happiness in their lives. Wealth may bring a measure of happiness, but those who enjoy a moderate amount of wealth righteously acquired will inevitably be far more contented than those who acquire their wealth by unscrupulous means. Though its actual ownership is not disputed, dubious wealth doesn't really belong to its owner in any genuine sense. For under the laws of true justice, Dhamma condemns such gains, bestowing fruits of misery as just rewards for the future. Wise people view this prospect with great trepidation, but we, of lesser intelligence, still prefer to scramble headlong after our desires, selfishly indulging in pleasures that come along without ever getting enough to satisfy our appetites. No matter how hard we try, we never seem to experience the kind of contentment that we long for. During his years in Chiang Mai, Acariya received numerous letters from Chao Kun Thamachedi of Wat Pa Baan Monastery in the Udon Thani province. In his letters, Chao Kun Thamachedi, who had been a disciple of Acariya since his youth, always invited him to return to Udon Thani. Acariya never replied to those letters, nor did he accept the invitation. Then, in the year 1940, Chao Kun Thamachedi traveled from Udon Thani all the way to the isolated region where Acariya lived to invite him personally, and thus gave him a chance to answer all the correspondence he had received. He told Chao Kun Thamachedi that he had read all his letters, but he reckoned they were small and insignificant compared to the big letter that had just arrived, so now he was ready to reply. That said, both monks laughed heartily. At the first opportunity, Chao Kun Thamachedi personally invited Acariya to return to the province of Udon Thani, where he once lived so many years before. Chao Kun Thamachedi informed him that his disciples in Udon Thani, missing him very much, had asked him to invite Acariya on their behalf. This time he could not object. He had to accept. Chao Kun Thamachedi suggested they work out a timetable for picking up Acariya and escorting him back to Udon Thani. They decided on the beginning of May 1940. As his departure from the mountain retreat became imminent, large groups of terrestrial Devas pleaded with him to stay. Being very reluctant to see him leave, they told him that Devas from all realms experienced peace and contentment while he lived there, due to the power of loving kindness which emanated from him and issued in all directions, day and night. Feeling very happy in his presence, They all greatly revered him. They were unwilling to have him leave, for they knew that their sense of contentment from his presence would soon fade. Even their social cohesion could be affected as a result. Acariya told them that, having given his word, he must leave. He must honor his promise. He couldn't possibly renege on it. Unlike most people, a monk's word is a solemn covenant. A monk is a man of virtue, so he must remain true to his word. If he goes back on a promise, his virtue immediately disappears and his worth as a monk is then devalued. So a monk must preserve his moral integrity. When May arrived, Acariya and the monks accompanying him to Udon Thani left their mountain retreat and began the long trek to the city of Chiang Mai, where they stayed at Wat Luang Monastery. Acariya of Wat Pa Monastery arrived with some lay supporters at about the same time to receive Acariya and to escort him to Udon Thani. Acariya remained at Wat Luang Monastery for about 1 week. During that time, a large group of his local devotees came to persuade him to extend his stay in Chiang Mai for the benefit of everyone there, but having accepted the invitation to Udon Thani, he could not delay his departure. Before he left, Tsao Kun Rajagawi asked him to give a special talk on the occasion of Visakha Puja to serve as a remembrance for his many devotees. At that time, I had just myself arrived in Chiang Mai, and so listened to this discourse with great interest. He spoke for exactly 3 hours that day, and what he said was so impressive that I have never forgotten it. Here is the essence of what he said. Today is Visakha Puja. It celebrates the day the Lord Buddha was born, the day he attained enlightenment, and the day he passed away into Parinibbana. The birth of a Buddha stands in marked contrast to the births of all other beings. In being born, the Buddha did not succumb to worldly illusions about birth, life, or death. More than that, through the power of his all-encompassing wisdom, he was able to realize the true nature of birth, life, and death, attaining what we call enlightenment. At the appropriate time, he bid farewell to his khantas, which were the tools he relied on to develop virtue to perfection, and then passed away, sugato, as befits a world teacher who is absolutely beyond reproach. Before departing his physical body, which had reached the end of its natural life, he bequeathed the Dhamma to the world, intending that it represent him and fulfill the role of teacher in his stead. Such a gift is worthy of our complete faith and worthy of any sacrifice. As you know, we are born as human beings because we possess sufficient inherent goodness to make it possible. But we shouldn't take ourselves and our inherent goodness for granted by neglecting to develop virtuous qualities in this life to enhance our future lives. Otherwise, the human status we enjoy may disappear to be irrevocably eclipsed by a low, undesirable birth. Be it high status or low status, with happiness of every possible degree up to the ultimate happiness, or pain and suffering of every possible degree down to the most excruciating, we ourselves are responsible for our own life circumstances. Don't think that only those presently affected by adverse circumstances experience such things. As potential life situations, they are shared in common by everyone, becoming our own personal heritage if and when we create the conditions for them. For this reason, the Buddha taught that we should never look down on other people, holding them in contempt. Seeing someone living in misery or abject poverty, we should reflect on the possibility that one day we could also find ourselves in such a position, or one even worse. At the moment of reckoning, none of us has the power to avoid the consequences of our actions. All of us share the same capacity to make good and bad Dhamma, so it's possible that someday we will be in their position and they will be in ours. The sasana is a doctrine that we can use to examine ourselves and others, enabling us to correctly choose the best possible way forward. In this respect, it has no equal. Throughout my many years as a monk, I have remained firmly committed to the practice of examining myself, striving always to discriminate between the good and the bad things arising within me from moment to moment. I now clearly realize that the heart is the principal instigator in the creation of Dhamma. In other words, our hearts are the source of all Dhamma, Dhamma that belongs solely to the one who makes it. There should be no doubt about this. Those doubting the existence of Dhamma, and so disbelieving of its effects, blindly take their own situation for granted until they're beyond redemption. Although they've been born and raised by their parents, such people fail to see the value of the mother and father who gave them life and sustenance. They look no further than their own selfish existence, unaware of how awful it really is, for they care little that they were born and raised by parents who supported their growth and development in every way. A child's body is nourished by the food and drink its parents provide, allowing it to grow up strong and healthy. If such actions are not Dhamma, what then should they be called? And if the nourishment the body receives in this way is not the fruit of Dhamma, then what else, in truth, could it be? Obviously, there is a root cause for all the goodness and evil, all the happiness and suffering experienced by people everywhere in the world. When someone's reckless thinking leads him to commit suicide, there's a reason behind it. The root cause, Dhamma, manifesting itself within the heart, can have such an impact on a person that he actually takes his own life without realizing that the Dhamma he has already created is playing a role. What is that but total blindness? Dhamma exists as a part of our very being. We create Dhamma every moment, just as the results of our previous Dhamma arise to affect us every moment. If you insist on doubting the existence of Dhamma and its results, then you are stuck at a dead end. Dhamma is not something that follows us like a dog following its master. On the contrary, our very thoughts, speech, and actions are Dhamma. The true results of Dhamma are the degrees of happiness and suffering experienced by all beings in the world, including those beings who live out their lives unaware of Dhamma. Such ignorance is also a karmic consequence. I myself listened to this talk with heartfelt satisfaction, as I had long been keenly interested in Acariya Man. I experienced such a deep sense of joy about him and his Dhamma that I felt as if I were floating on air. I felt that I simply couldn't hear enough. I have given you the gist of what he said so that all of you, who had no opportunity to hear him speak, may understand something about the nature of your Dhamma. Dhamma being something common to us all, it is possible you may recognize your own Dhamma in his words. When he finished speaking, Acariya Man rose from his seat and prostrated himself in front of the main Buddha image. Chaukun Rajagawi told him how much everyone had enjoyed the outstanding discourse he had just delivered. Acariya Man replied that it might well be his final encore, since he probably wouldn't return to give another talk due to his declining years. This was his way of telling everyone present that he would not return to Chiang Mai again before he died. As it turned out, this was true. Acariya Man never again returned to Chiang Mai. After remaining several more days at Wat Luang Monastery, Acariya Man finally left, heading first for Bangkok. Somdet Pra Maha Wirawang and the other senior monks, together with scores of lay supporters, escorted him from the monastery to the train station. Also present was a host of devas. Acariya Man said that devas filled the sky around him in every direction, as they too came to escort him to the station. They remained, hovering in the sky, even after he reached the station, waiting to send him off before returning to their respective realms. A chaotic scene ensued as he had to greet the scores of monks and lay people who were gathered there, while he simultaneously tried to psychically bestow his blessing upon all the devas who hovered in the air for a final blessing from him. In the end, he was able to turn his undivided attention to the devas and bestow his final blessing only after he had finished speaking to all the people and the train began pulling out of the station. He said he truly felt sorry for those devas who held him in such high esteem that they were reluctant to see him leave. They showed all the same signs of distress and disappointment that human beings do. Some even continued to hover behind the train as it sped down the tracks, until finally Acariya Man felt it necessary to tell them to return to their respective realms. They departed reluctantly, wondering if he would ever come back to assist them again. In the end they were to be disappointed, for he never did return. He never mentioned whether the terrestrial devas of Chiang Mai came to visit him later on when he lived in the provinces of Udon, Thani, and Sagon Nakhon.